Okay, everyone. This is the Equal Justice Podcast. My name is Anthony Costello. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. I'm here today with Logan Zeppieri, and this is our sort of series on which is a little bit more of a deep dive, where we are trying to carefully read through, analyze, offer some hopefully helpful criticism to some essays that were written by Dr. Nathan Cartagena, assistant professor of philosophy at Wheaton University in Illinois. Very prestigious Christian institution, to say the least. Dr. Cartagena's pedigree is excellent. He has philosophy degrees from, I believe it's Texas A&M or Texas A&M, I think, or Texas, and Baylor, his PhD from Baylor. So we know that he is educationally well equipped. But we've had our concerns. These series of essays are going to be formed into a book. We've already reviewed a panel discussion that Dr. Cartagena was part of, a CCCU panel discussion. You can find that. We will link to that discussion where Dr. Cartagena is joined by several others who seem to really genuinely want to embrace critical race theory. And Logan, I think what we're getting a sense of in reading the work or listening to the interviews with some of these fellow Christians who are on board with critical race theory is, it seemed to want to use it more than just an analytical tool to figure out better ways to sort of amend or adapt some of our legal system. But that really, this is now moving into the realm of how we need to adapt, amend our ways of knowing. So our epistemology, potentially our metaphysics. So more broadly, our theology in general. And this is where I think that move, we're very wary of that move from taking this to, which originally was a way to look at some concrete aspects of the law and maybe figure out why or how sort of a history of racism was still, ingrained in some sort of some of the legal system and some concrete laws.
Yeah.
But now that we can just sort of take this and apply it to theology, more broadly, or Christianity as a whole.
Well, I think the idea that it's just a tool, CRT is just a tool, came about in a response to a response that we've done and others have done to some of the concerns with CRT. I think, though, what's important, though, is it wasn't an ill-found concern. When you look at the scholars, and as we go through this essay, the individuals that Cartagena is referring to and referencing, they're making these claims as well. And what we don't see in his papers or even in his panel is a clear disassociation with the worldview building aspect of it. Right. It seems to be, at least in the articles that we've read so far, it seems like there is an acceptance or maybe a not actually refuting or distancing themselves from that aspect that we are claiming. So I think it didn't necessarily start out as just this sort of objective analysis of law, how it came to be and how it's being applied. It started off as very much an activist project to overturn a particular kind of legal structure, almost separate from maybe the sort of augmenting tool structure that they tend to kind of throw out. Oh, CRT is just something we can add another lens to the existing situation to make it more just. They're saying, no, we actually need to put in a whole new legal system backed by a particular worldview.
Which would get rid of basically much of the political philosophy of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century that sort of shaped America and the West. And that has brought a lot of freedom and democracy to much of the world, as Jacob Daniel has pointed out so many times in our own podcasts. So, well, let's start off. Now we're backtracking a little bit. We're going back to part one of this three-part series of essays by Dr. Cartagena. Part two we will link to as well, where we get a little more in depth on some of the sources that he's drawing from. But and again, the essays are simply entitled Critical Race Theory, A Christian's Reflections. And Logan, he opens up with some epigraphs. First one is a quote from Cornel West. Quote, critical race theory is the most exciting development in contemporary legal studies. Now there it does have the legal, end quote, the legal aspect, but digging a little bit more into that Cornel West quote, you seem to think that again, it's not really just legal studies here that we're talking about.
No, exactly. And this quote, he links into it. We'll link into the podcast description. A CRT book. It has like a series of essays from the founders of CRT. This particular quote comes from the foreword that's written by Cornel West. And if you read through all the way to the end of that foreword, Cornel West, he writes, because I mean, the question you have to ask is, okay, what is critical race theory and why is it exciting? And you get the two, this is the opening sentence, I believe, of that preface. He writes, in short, critical race theory is an intellectual movement that is both particular to our postmodern and conservative times and part of a long tradition of human resistance and liberation. On the one hand, the movement highlights a creative, intention-ridden fusion of theoretical self-reflection, formal innovation, radical politics, existential evaluation, reconstructive experimentation, and vocational anguish. But like all bold attempts to reinterpret and remake the world, which that's the concern that has been, I think, rightly raised by us and others, to reveal silent suffering and to relieve social misery, critical race theorists put forward novel readings of a hidden past that disclose the flagrant shortcomings of the treacherous present in the light of unrealized, though not unrealizable, possibilities for human freedom and equality. So I think, yes, a lot of the times people will quote these individuals by saying, see, it's just legal studies. See, it's just a tool. We're just trying to figure it out. But if you read all the way through, the writer's own interpretation of the project that they're doing is worldview building or reinterpreting worldviews. And the question has to come, okay, well, what does that mean? What kind of worldview is being put in its place? What reinterpretation's happening? What is it trying to undermine? And I think that's a proper concern that we've been raising, and others have been raising. I've said this already, but and we'll get to some of the points that Nathan makes later on that. The second quote, though, is interesting because he quotes the Conservative Baptist Network as well.
Right.
I've since looked it up. I think they changed that quote. I couldn't find it, even with the LinkedIn. But the quote that he gives is, the Conservative Baptist Network rejects various unbiblical ideologies currently affecting the Southern Baptist Convention, such as critical race theory, intersectionality, and social justice. Now, without reading that Cornell quote, what you get, sorry, is sort of, on the one side, is an exciting new legal study. On the other side, you have the conservatives that are just kind of upset with this new thing that's exciting. Yeah. I think the question, though, and this should really go to the forefront of our minds, is why would the Conservative Baptist Network be claiming that it has unbiblical ideologies if it's just a legal, some sort of abstract legal tool?
Right. Well, there's a couple things I'll add to that. One, I mean, when you read that full quote from Cornel West, you know, and this again goes to your emerging sense of something about critical race theory, or maybe even critical theories more broadly, having this sort of Nietzschean resentment in there where, you know, we've been so failed by the political philosophies or even the theology of the past, you know, that we have to find a way to overturn everything that they've done, you know, because it's only been white oppression. It's only been colonialism and domination. And one thing that you've pointed out is this is can oftentimes sort of come off as a very simplistic reading of history, right? You know, sort of neglecting the vast good that has also come through various forms of colonialism or through the political philosophy that drove the war for independence in the United States, that facilitated the abolition movement, that motivated Americans to fight a civil war, et cetera, et cetera. And that certainly, if it doesn't get pushed to the background, it it won't really get mentioned. You know, it sort of wants to be. The idea here is that, you know, we can't shed any light on the positives of human flourishing. That you know, I don't want to say white supremacy, that's their term, but, you know, that the principles or the founding principles of, you know, the United States, the founding fathers of the United States, the Constitution, and so on and so forth. You don't want to shed any positive light on that, because that sort of just weakens your rhetorical force, you know, for this idea that everything has to be overturned. And I think we're seeing, again, as we go through, we're seeing the same impulse with regards to theology. Everything about theology since Latin, you know, in the Latin West, at least since the Reformation, maybe even 100 years prior to the Reformation, has to be dismantled. And this comes off as a very, again, reductionistic and simplistic sort of reading of history.
And that's where I think, as we move into the essay now, the important part is you have the details of the debate. Questions about, do they get you know, European colonialism right? Do they get the SCOTUS rulings right? Do they get the American founding right? So you have those critiques. But then you sort of have this meta conversation of, is CRT a worldview builder,
Right.
or is it just an analytic tool? And
Right.
Nathan has made the argument, and others in his line of thinking have made that argument. The question we're asking, though, is, it doesn't seem like the founders of CRT would agree, and it doesn't look like you've made a clear case on why that is to be true in your essay. So then maybe there's more writings to come, but it seems like at least the meta argument, is it a worldview or worldview builder, or is it a tool, seems to flow to the side that says, in fact, it seems like it's a worldview builder. The people who you're quoting seems to agree as well.
Right. And I referenced in another video, I believe, that we did, that when we start working within the framework of social theory as a discipline, you know, and I quoted, you know, I quoted James Bowman's article on critical theory in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where he's referencing Max Horkheimer's view of what a social or what a critical theory is. And Horkheimer, of course, was one of the founding fathers of the Frankfurt School, which gave birth to critical theory. And Bowman says, and I'll quote here one more time from the article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quote, echoing Marx in the German ideology, Horkheimer insists that for a critical theory, the world and subjectivity in all its forms have developed with the life processes of society, end quote. So you're going to need to do a lot of Christianizing of any sort of tool or academic view that is operating solely within the framework of a critical theory or a social theory, that rejects any sense of there being anything we can know outside of whatever society produces as knowledge. And we'll get to this a little bit more down the line of the fundamental difference between a Christian epistemology, where it is the intellect grasping truth, versus a social theory epistemology, where it is the person or the group producing knowledge, producing truth, if we want to call it that way.
Yeah, and I think it's safer to say that there's been more academic work arguing how and under what conditions CRT or other critical theories will reinterpret the world than there has been distinguishing from that project and saying it is an analytic tool.
Right.
It seems like all the scholars being cited, specifically the scholars he's citing, are all on the margins of this is a worldview
Right.
building and reinterpreting.
Right.
It seems like there's a few who's just claiming
Mm-hmm.
it's just a tool, and there has to be some scholarly work on that, at least minimally.
Right. Maybe there's some lawyers who are critical theorists, right? And they're just looking at very particular aspects of law. But a lot of these people are talking about getting rid of sort of every sort of aspect of human culture that has arisen since, the 15th or 16th century. Capitalism and, sort of like, Christian theology and so on and so forth. But okay. So he starts off first section, critical race theory in the church. And he mentions that in 2015, Christians, and, I think here he's especially concerned about evangelical Protestant Christians in America, although it might apply to some degree to Roman Catholics as well. They had to change their approach to race. And he lists a few of the controversial incidents that had to do with police: Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Freddie Gray, which was all some of these controversial killings that involved the authorities. But then he also mentions a white supremacist, a clear-cut case of sort of white supremacy, the murder of 9 members of the Emmanuel African Methodist Church in Charleston. Yeah. And I thought it interesting, Logan, that he seems to sort of conflate two already right there. There seems to be a conflation to me of two very different kinds of events. And this is, I think, just the tricky waters of critical race theory, where critical race theory, on the one hand, wants to talk about systemic issues embedded in the system, where even if you didn't have an actual racist in the culture, the system, just in virtue of being put together 150, 200 years ago, or whatever, by people who were racist, has problems, versus what we've been trying to call this like common sense racism. Simple racism or something like this, which is, hey, there was this kid who just hated black people because of their skin color and went into their church and shot them up.
Yeah. And it's hard to make the case as, well, this section might be functioning in a little different way, but it seems like using these examples, they want to make the claim that they're tips of an iceberg, of a systemic iceberg. It's hard, though, to make the case that the institution of slavery or the 1790 Naturalization Act or certain Jim Crow laws made this individual go and shoot up a church. The connection seems to be very remote at best. Now, this section, though, I think you're right on that, the distinction between the individual act versus the systemic question which they're trying to raise. But he opens up with something that I'm not entirely sure is distinguishable from what would be considered a political narrative, which was, if you go back to Obama when he was running, this narrative that was kind of produced by the left, which was something like, if you elect President Obama, racism will be over. Mm-hmm. Now, that wasn't the conservative argument. It seemed to be a persuasive narrative, but you have to be careful that when he says, in the very second sentence, actually, not the first, or I guess technically the third sentence, that there was a chorus of voices claiming that the U.S. had become a post-racial society, this sort of utopian vision that we finally made it, didn't stem from conservative scholars. This came from a political fight that was emerging during an election year.
Yeah.
And then the second thing, though, is but I do think he's right in the sense that for those who did make that claim, electing an individual person who represents, a black individual
Mm-hmm.
doesn't state whether or not something's post-racial or you don't have racial intention. I think that's correct. I think you just have to be careful when you bring in political fights and say, see, this is what the culture was saying, when it was clearly a cultural battle for the highest office in the land. It
Yeah,
happened to
good
be a
point.
narrative that very much pushed, whether or not you agree with Obama's policies, whether or not you're Republican or Democrat, there has to be some sense in which you realize there was a political election and you're going to bring up narratives to help further your party's position.
Right. So who that chorus of voices were that were declaring U.S. Post-racial society, what was what was motivating them to say that,
Yeah,
would
because
matter.
I think most conservatives, by and large, would say that, or even going to some of Sowell's work,
Mhm.
that racism's you're not going to have a post-racism humanity.
Right.
That seems to be out of the question,
Yeah.
because now you're saying we've gotten to the point where particular sin is no longer relevant. I
Yes.
don't think you'll ever get to that.
We've excised a particular sin from human nature,
Yeah, I
which
don't
is
know if
just not
that's
the conservative. That's just not a traditionally conservative understanding of human nature.
exactly.
You
And so I
know,
do think you have to be careful of who is, as you said, who is the
right?
chorus of voices.
Who was the chorus of voices? Good point. Excellent
Because it
point.
wasn't the SBC per se. I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. Exactly. They weren't saying, "Oh, now that we've elected Obama, racism will vanish off the face of God's creation."
Yeah.
No, I don't think any conservatives were making that point. Um, so these were horrendous injustices. Now, again, there I'd say, well, it's controversial as to whether or not, I don't know much about the Garner and Gray cases, but after watching Shelby Steele's film, What Killed Michael Brown, I'd say you'd have to at least make some distinction between the killing of the 9 at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was clearly an injustice, and the killing of Michael Brown, where I think it's still an open debate on whether or not that was a just or unjust use of violence. So again, this is where we would hope or encourage that, when this gets into maybe book form, Dr. Cartagena has made maybe a little bit more nuanced, added some more nuance to his claims here.
Yeah. And one thing, maybe this would be an interesting conversation to have. Because I'm just finishing up Michelle Alexander's work, The New Jim Crow. But this still happens even with the series of examples he gives. Start looking at the locations they bring up. You have Ferguson, Missouri, which is in Greater St. Louis. You have NYPD with Eric Gardner.
Mm-hmm.
You have Baltimore Police with Freddie Gray. You have, she all the time refers to Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Chicago. When you start looking at these places, I don't think it's sufficient to say they've been Democrat controlled, it's a Democrat problem. But it is interesting to think of, okay, what kind of policies are being implemented that seem to be along these lines of very particular political parties? And that would be an interesting social question to ask, because when you see on the news, they say there's been a 400% hate crimes. Where do they go? Los Angeles and New York City. Well, that's interesting because they've been dominated by a very particular political ideology for some time now.
Right.
And it doesn't seem like it's getting better. Seattle, Portland, other
Chicago.
examples that Michelle Alexander uses. It would be an interesting question.
A good job of highlighting Chicago as well as in that film, because he's from Chicago, and I am familiar intimately with some of the neighborhoods that he highlights in that movie. So I definitely would commend people to watch that and disseminate it as well. A very important film.
Yeah, and Steele does a good example, because he talks about engaging with those programs himself and seeing the question of you have these utopian visions that come into a particular community, you have the flow of money, you have gang violence, you have particular interests, and then trying to navigate that. And he puts a very bleak picture, but He does recount in his book White Guilt, where he was talking to one of the architects of this vision. He said, we were doing so good, it was so good, it was so good. And he said, what happened if it was so good that when the money was gone, it all fell apart? So he does raise up some interesting questions that have, for the most part, gone, unscrutinized.
Well, and if there's one thing I think that comes through in that film that is clearly articulated, is that the way to improve the experiences of urban Black families is not by deconstructing the entire system of American governance.
Right. Yeah.
or Christian theology. Although he doesn't get into that aspect of it explicitly. Okay, so, going back to the Cornell West, I did want to make this one point, though, that because you brought up the Democrat-controlled cities as being some of the ones that have the bigger problems of race.
Yeah. Well, not so much me making the claim. These are the examples they're using.
Yeah, right.
When they go down the list, I'm saying, well, there seems to be, these are the examples you're using.
You're just pointing out right, exactly what critical race theorists like Alexander themselves are using, and that these cities have been dominated by a particular political agenda and narrative for decades.
Yeah.
But, we have made the point before, and I think it's worth saying again, that critical race theory, while you're probably going to be hard pressed to find many political conservatives who are going to be on board with critical race theory or theorists, it's not like critical race theory is something where you're automatically going to accept it if you're politically liberal on other issues, right? No. And we've mentioned so many people who are politically liberal in on many other social and economic issues, but who fervently are rejecting the use of critical race theory, both as certainly as a worldview, but also even as a useful tool, and I'll just list a couple names again. John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, I think would fall into that category. Andrew Sullivan has been highly critical of intersectionality and critical race theory, and others, whites, Blacks, non-Christians, people who are politically liberal, though,
or even atheists. You have even people who are not, or
right,
non, or you have Richard Dawkins coming out being like, well, this seems to be going there. So people you would have not thought would have been on the same side is cutting. That's why I wanted to say it's not just Democrat controlled. Go ahead.
We've mentioned James Lindsay's work before, and his book Cynical Theories, and so on and so forth. Okay,
these are go ahead.
So he goes. So Dr. Cartagena goes on. Nathan goes on to say, this has led to a lot of. So there having to be a new conversation in the church about race issues. But then he goes on to say that there's been two problems by Christians, church leaders, pastors, Christian leaders who have some kind of public platform. And that is that they've either been silent on critical race theory, or they've done just a really poor job of sort of saying why they're against it, but they've come out being against it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that would be the following section. Let me just say something before we close out that first section of it was entitled CRT in the Church. He ends that section by saying, for some, CRT is an ideology antithetical to the gospel. For others, it is a helpful tool Christians should employ to facilitate justice and love of neighbor. And for others, CRT remains a nebulous phrase and nothing more. I wanted to say that I think that's fair to prop up those three positions as kind of what's on the table at the moment.
Right.
What I think has to be careful, and this is what we see, I think, it could be from both sides. I've seen this happen where, and not just particular to the CRT debate, where if you disagree with CRT, you're not on the side that says CRT is ideological antithetical to the gospel. What they do is try to push you into that you just think CRT is a nebulous phrase. You don't really understand what's being taught or being said by the CRT side. So you have to recognize those are the
Yes.
three positions on the table, and it's legitimate for each person to at least reside in those positions and make their cases from that position. I think very often people say, no, I think it's antithetical to the gospel. I think there's some questions, and we're going to dig into this if this is happening in this paper, where if they disagree, they actually just don't know what CRT is, and
Right.
that you have to be careful of.
Right. It's assumed if you disagree that you haven't done your homework.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just haven't read enough books or whatever, or read the right books or so on and so forth. So there's a question here of whether or not one could read all the relevant material and still disagree, justifiably disagree. And we want to say that certainly there are people out there who have done that. They've done exactly that. They have studied the relevant material and they firmly believe that it is neither useful as a tool and certainly not something that should be embraced as a worldview.
Yeah. Now, going to what you're saying, yes, I think the next section is entitled Silence and Lack of Clarity,
right?
Which he's going to claim, I think, he thinks is the two prevailing problems in current evangelical circles, or maybe, no, I don't think he says more broadly. I think he's keeping it to the evangelicals. He lists a couple, the Conservative Baptist Network, John MacArthur, Neil Shenvi. I think there's a few things that could be said, and that is his site of who he refers to and those who he doesn't refer to. In passing really quick, I think we've mentioned this in other podcasts that you have someone like Bodhi Bakum who's spoken on this continually, who's within this sort of evangelical for a very long time. There's no reference to. So I think there is some sort of missing on those who have done, or the people we've been interviewing, who have a ton to say about CRT that would be classified as evangelical.
You'd have to say there's been a lot of people who haven't been silent or unclear. They've jumped right on board with it.
Yeah.
There's those people too. And I do want to refer people also back to a February 21st Manhattan Institute interview that Coleman Hughes did with John Yoo, who is a professor of law at Stanford, and Christopher Rufo, who's been writing about critical theory and critical race theory for several years, who's sort of a boots on the ground journalist, where, there's another sort of reason why a lot of people don't want to touch critical race theory. And this outside the church. And John Yoo makes this point, is because when you do, you get ostracized. And people just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with the personal attacks, the ad hominems that seem to come along with weighing in on critical race theory critically. So there's something very uncharitable about how critical race theory has been presented in the secular academy for decades now. So I'm a little suspicious about Dr. Cartagena's approach here, which feels very critical and heavy-handed towards church leaders and pastors and stuff, as if they should have not only known about critical race theory for the last 30 years, they should have known everything about it. Although, as we're going to see later, he's going to go on to say it's a very ambiguous movement with incompatible traditions and but apparently pastors and church elders and other sort of leaders are supposed to know everything about it, so that
they're supposed to be able to define a particular theory that the theorists within the tradition have been unable to define.
And again, I hate to sound uncharitable in my assessment so far, because obviously we don't know Dr. Cartagena personally, but I don't know. This idea that the church has been silent, well, maybe it's been silent for good reasons, because it's a mess of a theory. Like, get your theory in order first before the church has to necessarily respond.
Yeah, and I think it's we should also make a careful distinction where when he says the critique against the church isn't that the church has been silent on racism.
Yes.
Because that's clearly not the case. And it's been silent about particular views concerning critical race theory.
And
And that's an important distinction.
I think he really does himself a disservice. I hate to say this as a scholar when he quotes Martin Luther King Jr. here, who I was clearly talking about racism
Mm-hmm.
and not critical race theory, which really hadn't even been articulated yet in the 1960s during the Civil Rights era. And he uses the Martin Luther King. I think Martin Luther King Jr. he gets so. I never reference Martin Luther King Jr. because I just feel like people are just using him because he's been lionized at this point, and but I feel like it's like clearly Martin Luther King Jr. is talking about white churches, white society being silent about the problem of racial bigotry, not about some theory.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a misuse of that quote. Anyways.
Yeah. Well, so I think the first one is, in passing, he does miss out on a lot of people who have been talking about this subject. I think there is the question, as you brought up with John Yoo and others, where it seems like if you speak out against or critique critical race theory, you are ostracized. But then the people he does quote, I think what's important is to not ask the question, are they just being ambiguous in their kind of offensive maneuvers in responding to CRT, but are they being appropriate to their background specialization and their sort of fencing or hemming in what is able to be done within the confines of critical race theory? So you have someone like when they quote John MacArthur, he's talking about, well, it seems like whatever critical race theory does, it can't divide us by race. That seems to be not biblical.
Right.
It can't divide us into oppressed oppressors, because now you're kind of imputing certain sort of sins and certain sort of virtues arbitrarily to individuals. So he kind of hems in, I think, from what his background is. You can't have someone who's been a pastor's entire life switch over to CRT and be able to respond to it. He's saying, well, seems like whatever CRT is, it has to at least be mindful of these theological truths. And if where it transgresses those, that's where it's violating, he thinks, the gospel, and you should prefer the gospel's interpretation to the human condition than to CRT, which I think is a fair move.
And another thing we should also point out is, and again, maybe this will be different in the book length treatment, but some of these statements that were made by like the Southern Baptist Convention, or maybe even by a particular church, the statements oftentimes are the summaries. They're the summations of more work that's been done, and that they're just being messaged succinctly, just so people know where that church organization or that particular church stands on an issue. But maybe if, we should give people the benefit of the doubt that they might have actually, that the reading, the hard work also stands behind those more succinct summaries. I mean, there is a Bible behind the creeds, right? So, we don't know that because we haven't looked into everything that the Southern Baptist Convention has done on CRT or the 6 Southern Baptist Seminary presidents. But again, as I made this point when we were responding to one of Phil Vischer's podcasts, it stretches credulity for me to think that Al Mohler has not at least done some work, intellectual work, with regards to critical race theory before he signed his name to that statement by the Southern Baptist Seminary leadership, right? Like he just willy-nilly signed his name to that thing, but has no clue about critical theory, social theories, critical race theories, critical legal studies, which I just guarantee you he does.
Yeah, and you've made this point before. I think John MacArthur does a good job in kind of validating that point, because he quotes something about John MacArthur saying that anger, resentment, and vengeful separation he's attributing to CRT. I think there's something to be said about the academic theorizing that goes into a particular theory, and kind of, as you said, like the boots on the ground. How is this affecting the church? Who within the church is adopting this theory? How is it being employed? And when a pastor is responding to perhaps congregational woes, you can't be in a position to go, well, you just don't understand the theory in its abstract ivory tower sense. Like, well,
Right.
it is also a valid response to say, but when you implement it, there seems to be some destructive force that we do really need to contend with. And that is, I think, a
And
valid objection to crafting a particular theory. There has to be an ebb and flow between the ivory tower and sort of the ground at which it's built from.
I'll give a generic, and I won't name the church's names for the sake of, some anonymity, but I was I was going to two churches. One is a very large, well-known church with a long history in the area here, predominantly white. And there were leanings towards just embracing social justice and critical race theory. And it was causing division among young white people, basically. One young man was giving me some of the anecdotes in his own life because he was just a very incisive sort of critical thinker, and he was pushing back a little bit on some of the narrative that was filtering down. Now, I'm no longer at that church. Now I'm at a church where I'm one of two white people, if you want to take white to mean of European descent. Well, can't even say that because
like Western European descent.
Obviously, Mexicans are of European descent too.
Yeah.
But one of two whitish people that isn't Hispanic, I guess. And everybody's there is suspicious, if not just firmly against anything social justice, critical race theory. This is a very conservative church. And I mean, I'm just putting that out there that there, in the one church, the bigger, predominantly white church, the effect was division between friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, maybe even husbands and wives. It was causing division, Now, I don't know that the pastor really got his arms around that problem, and maybe it's still ongoing. And I'm not trying to judge him, but then when I go, now that I'm fully embedded in the smaller, very less white church, but where there's almost absolute agreement that the whole social justice movement that's born out of critical race theory is antithetical to the gospel. We're not going to have that around here. It's not going to divide us. So, okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, which does lead me now, there's this claim that Dr. Cartagena does make in his paper. He gets into sort of a personal story here, although he doesn't give concrete details. And this has been one of my pet peeves in some of the things I've seen written by people who want to embrace critical race theory, is also then claiming they've been victims of some kind of racial or racialized attacks. He says, as a racialized minority suffering from internal and external forms of racism. I don't know exactly what he means by internal and external. This betrayal hurts. He says he has racialized wounds. Now, again, I just raised the point that I struggle these days, same thing with some of the claims that were made in the panel discussion. This is where I just say, look, you got to give me concrete incidents if you're going to make these claims of being a victim, being wounded, being treated as racially inferior. Especially when I see his pedigree. He'd been to some excellent programs. I would want to know if the directors of those programs are racists and how they actually treated him as he went through his philosophy degrees. I mean, if as a parent, if I had children and I were considering sending them off to Baylor or Texas A&M, I think it was Texas A&M. I had looked at the CV again. It might be Texas. I'd want to know. I'd want to know who's there, what kind of decisions are being made. I mean, do these people really have racial bias, and how was he wounded? I mean, otherwise, I worry that people are they're making claims for rhetorical purposes. I mean, again, I don't want to make my own accusation, but I'm suspicious, at least.
Yeah. Well, I think we're in a society now where to ask for the facts of a situation is now to somehow be victim blaming. I had this conversation back when the Me Too movement was kind of coming to its like pinnacle moment. And some situations had happened, and I had in the media, and I had said, well, I think this individual should take that person to court and filed. I mean, if it's sexual harassment, if it's just rape, statutory or not, there should be handled in court, evidence brought, a jury. We should go through the process. And an individual responded to me, wait, are you saying that someone who has been raped has to face the person who perpetuated rape? I said, yes. That's part of the court system, that you have to bring the charges up. You have to have a jury. You have to evaluate the evidence. Yes, it's hard to go through that trial, but if what he did, in other words, if you don't go through the trial, if the argument is that the trial is too hard, you're saying that the crime is not as bad as the experience it left on the person.
Right.
You have to be able to say, you know what, I have to go through this pain to make sure justice is served.
This is huge. Let's stay on this for a second, because I looked up, and it was Grove City College, I think was his undergrad, and then Texas A&M. I was right, and Texas A&M, which has a great, very well-known philosophy program, and Baylor, which we know has an astounding program, especially for Christian philosophy, or doing philosophy from a Christian standpoint. I just, somebody who has been privy to what a story of somebody's story of victimhood, how it can fall apart completely when a lawyer just asks some pinpoint questions, factual questions, and having seen that firsthand, and seeing how the narrative falls apart. And these were serious allegations too. You make a good point. Your experience of it, if it's really that bad, then you have to be able to produce the evidence to show that your experience matches up to reality.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, the hope is that the evidence would then be used to inflict the appropriate consequence. What you're almost saying is that the pain of going through it, is more significant than the punishment that should be inflicted on the other person. I mean, that's
who might also do it again, I suppose.
Exactly. And so now you're well, this is what's so important is, because some people would hear this and go, oh, it's just, you just don't know how bad it is. No, what I'm saying is you have to incorporate, is the punishment of the individual less significant than reliving or retelling your experience? Is the possibility of that being inflicted on another person less problematic than your own experience? So now you have to start, when you start adding up the calculus, you're really making a very interesting claim when you say, I can't face the individual who did this to me because my experience is greater than, or the harms done by going through that experience again is greater than his crime and perhaps any of the continued criminal acts he does against other people.
Well, and the other thing I don't like about this is he says that this happened to him, right? Now, any of his professors or directors at Grove City, Texas A&M, and Baylor, now, unless he's talked to them about them already, but this is public work now.
Yeah.
So now you got a bunch of people who are thinking, which one of these people? It's kind of like what happened with the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Somebody in the royal family made this comment about what color their baby might be. Although Meghan Markle looks totally white to me. I don't know what race she is, but whatever. But they won't say who it is. So now you got a whole public out there who's speculating who's the racist person in the royal family.
It forms like a witch hunt. You're trying to find and speculate who the criminal is. And this is a side effect of not having, naming names or going through a legal proceeding, is then now you're just subjugating wholesale an entire royal family, saying it could be any one of you.
So as far as I'm concerned, all the departments, the philosophy department at Baylor and the philosophy department at Texas A&M are under indictment here. They've been indicted. Or I'm sorry, accused. There's an accusation here. Right? And we don't know.
And it's a serious accusation.
I'd be careful to throw that stuff out there.
Yeah.
Anyways, we should move on. But he does say, and I know we're gonna probably get a lot of pushback on this, but so be it. I mean, let's surface this stuff.
And just before we go to the last section,
Yeah.
because we do need to continue on.
Yeah.
He does make the comment about Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer.
Right.
He says, suggests that there are areas in which Christians should agree with critical race theory without specifying how those areas relate to the broader whole. I think that's an entirely misquoted. When you read through Shenvi's article, where he talks about, he lists, how many reasons? 5 reasons in which CRT is correct in certain ways and how that impacts the greater Christian church. I mean, that's the purpose of half the article. And so I don't know, without further explanation, just saying it, he doesn't do it. Well, that's the thrust of the article. He talks about how everything in critical race theory is not false, that certain things should be affirmed, like that race isn't a biological feature, and then talks about how it functions in the Christian worldview as you go down later in the article. He talks about the notion of hegemonic power. He talks about how CRT functions as a worldview. He talks about the problem of its understanding relationships and power dynamics. And he's, this was published in the Gospel Coalition. For Gospel Coalition article, it was pretty thorough. I mean, you can't expect him to write a journal article necessarily on this.
Yeah.
But I think the claim on its own is, I would be interested to see why Nathan believed it. He just didn't address how it connects to the greater whole. What part of this worldview is he looking at? But anyways, the next section.
I mean, I also took contention with his again saying that the people have been engaged in selective anti-intellectualism. Seems to me just because people don't read what you read, that doesn't mean that it's selective anti-intellectualism. But then let's get into this. But okay, why are people being selective? Well, the next section, academic fluidity of defining CRT, where he talks about how difficult it is for even scholars to sort of get an understanding of what critical race theory is. And here he mentions 3 scholars, Lewis Gordon, Charles Mills, Lucius Outlaw, who misidentify CRT. Yet again, your local pastor is supposed to be able to get this stuff and articulate it to his congregation. So, okay. I mean, same criticism that I sort of levied before. If scholars who work in this field can't even get a grip on this, it seems a little unseeming to make these charges against people in the church for not getting it.
Yeah, I mean, it puts pastors in an interesting position where if they totally don't say anything, then they fall under Nathan's critique of being silent.
Right.
If they say anything, they fall under the critique of not being specific enough.
Being ignorant.
Yeah. But it seems like the academic situation is also in such a flux that you don't have necessarily academics. So it would be possible under this section for a pastor to quote a CRT scholar and still be wrong in defining. Now, we're not, again, you're going to have all these issues whenever you use any theory or use its, all these theories are being debated. But I think it takes the edge off of the, wholesale condemnation of the evangelical community for not addressing this issue, or at least to the specifics that he's requiring.
I mean, look, I've been very critical so far. I understand as a scholar, he wants to get back to the original sort of critical race theorists from the 70s and 80s and early 90s who were doing sort of this, first and foremostly, this legal work. He talks about going back to the sources. And that's, obviously, that's the way scholarship should be done. It's commendable. And I don't think there's any problem in doing that. It's just he opens up with a lot of charging people with various sort of intellectual crimes, I guess, which I just don't feel was
or
really
being
necessary.
Anti-intellectual or something like that.
Okay, so he says, the church, he says, quote, confusion, next section, Confusion, misidentification, and gentrification characterizes academic treatments of CRT. Silence and name dropping typify treatments within the church. So he says, end quote, because of that, we need more light. We need a guide. And, presumption here is that he's going to be this guide for us. He's going to do all of the necessary reading. Or maybe we should say has done all the necessary reading so that he can sort of enlighten us.
Yeah. And I think it's just important as we move now on to this kind of the end of that section. We move past beyond academic fluidity into the need for a guide. It's just important to make that when we say that CRT is ill-defined, it's not us projecting onto CRT scholarship its ill-defined nature. This is Nathan bringing up that, in fact, within the scholarship, it is ill-defined. So just for the audience, so they can see what we're tracking, a lot of the claims we're making is more of a contextual responses. There are some that we've said, obviously, we think this is wrong, but there seems to be an incoherence within the system that he's bringing forward within this essay.
Now, he does describe himself as a race scholar teaching CRT at an evangelical Christian college. And I do want to make the point to people, whoever listens to this, that look, whether or not you like the idea of critical race theory, it is in the church and in the church's institutions. So it's there. It's going to be at every seminary to some degree or another, every Christian college. Andrew Sandlin has made this point in some of his lectures, if you can find them online. So, there has to be this, some give and take, some back and forth here. What struck me though also about him saying, I write as a race scholar. I think he's got very obviously fine credentials to address this topic, but we've seen recently, for example, Neil Shenvi get canceled from a Veritas forum. And I don't want to get into too many details about that because Neil wasn't credentialed in the area of critical race studies, right? Or race.
Yeah, I think that was the accusation.
Yeah. Because his PhD is in chemistry. He's a hard scientist, right? He's in the hard sciences.
Yeah.
Which kind of bothered me because I'm like, what does this mean? Like people can't pick up a book and read it, and understand it. And okay, but there's something to be said for being sort of in the milieu, in a particular dialogue. But one wonders here if, as a race scholar, Dr. Cartagena is equipped to go back and deal with scholars who are all lawyers and attorneys and were in legal studies. One could sort of nitpick here and say, well, he should go back and get his law degree before he makes any, but that's to get into this game of who can make pronouncements on what.
Yeah. Well, this is, I think this is important.
I don't necessarily think is a good way to go, but
yeah. Well, I think it's important though, is the question of when he said as a race scholar, how is that phrase functioning?
Yeah.
In this particular, is it a credentialing way in which he says, therefore I can say certain particular things?
Yeah.
The objection, the response objection would have to be something like, okay, does that mean when you quote things like the 1790 Naturalization Act, which is a law, that because you're not in legal studies or you don't have a JD or something like that, or whatever, however you want to define that, you really don't know the law? I don't know if that would be a fair objection. But the argument, though, I think, at least the implied view, is that if you don't have a degree in a particular subject, maybe you're not acquainted with the right material. However, I don't think that automatically means that if you go into a debate, you're just wrong. You have to bring up those counter arguments. And so there's this weird there's a natural inclination to think that if you don't have a degree in a particular subject, you might not be equipped to address it. But that doesn't provide the counter argument, which means you're wrong. It just might say, okay, well, maybe there's certain things he has to take into consideration, and the CRT scholars can bring that up, and a debate is a perfect platform to do that. So
well, it's a form of the genetic fallacy, right? that
Yeah.
somehow the person, because he doesn't have certain credentials, can't be a source of truth or justified knowledge. But the credentials aren't going to be determinative of whether or not somebody's making a good argument or a good point necessarily. You know, well, I wanted to make another thing. We'll get to that. We're going to get to that soon about how I wonder if critical race theory, the way it's operating in, I think, Nathan's paper and also amongst the panelists, isn't itself just making one huge genetic fallacy in the way it adjudicates over history, but or tries to judge history. But we'll get to that in a second. So he finishes this section saying, which is the wanting to be a guide for the church, by saying that, again, reiterating that CRT is a movement aimed at providing an anti-racist understanding of the relationship between race and law. So again, he does say it's about the legal studies here, or the legal realm at least.
Yeah, I think the next section will kind of test whether or not the definition is sufficient. I think having just briefly read Cornell West's understanding of CRT, we haven't gotten to Kimberly Crenshaw's, which I think is the next section. The question is, does this definition do justice for all it's trying to account for? So, for example, an anti-racist understanding seems to imply an oppositionalist understanding. This is going to be, trying to traffic in some Cornell West understanding of critical race theory, worldview interpretation. Some of the problems people have with CRT, the kind of the fundamental assumptions, which we'll get into next section, seem to not be explicitly named within this definition. So I think the definition in of itself seems to be insufficient for the work he's hoping it does.
Right. And then he ends that section again, just saying how diverse CRT is, contested, multi-layered movement, not a single theory, method, or analytical tool. And again, we've already pointed out that, again, maybe that's why it's been so difficult for people to speak about it in churches. Okay, and now this is where sort of for this first essay, we get sort of into the meat of what he's going to tell us critical race. He's going to try and then articulate for us what at least the common consensus features of critical race theory are. He says there's two interests that critical race theorists have in mind, and they've come to 5 sort of consensus conclusions. 2 interests and 5 conclusions. The first interest is to understand how white supremacy came into existence and how it has had lasting effects on, again, first and foremostly, the legal realm, but as we'll see, just even culture more broadly. But how white supremacy came to be and its lasting effects.
Well, I think we could be a little bit more specific. I don't know if he's trying to make or impute onto CRT that they're trying to figure out the description of the conditions under which white supremacy came to be, but the conditions under which white supremacy created a particular kind of system and how that particular system functions in subordinating people of color. So it just, it's a slight shift, but I don't know if Nathan would say that CRT is responsible for talking about maybe the sociological or psychological origins of why one particular group would be suppressed. It might be I think it'd be interesting. And I think it would be
we
much
kind of
more
touched
rounded
on that briefly in other podcasts about, how it seems to be that people will always pick some feature, some identifiable feature, noticeable one, if there's some reasons for some ulterior reasons for them to want to suppress or oppress another social group.
Yeah, if it's advantageous in some way. And
skin color could be, other things, but skin color is an obvious one.
Just religious adherence. You have the religious wars. So it's like pick a feature that's easily identifiable.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. So your good point. He's not saying that of why white supremacy emerged, but how people who believed that European culture or even white-skinned people were superior came to create legal systems, mercantile systems, whatever, that were advantageous to whites and disadvantageous to non-whites.
yeah, and then how that's maintained or perpetuated and so on and so forth. And he lists the two particular aspects as being the rule of law and equal protection, which are, I'm not sure if they analyze it so much as they just end up arguing that those are just features of a white supremacist society, is the view that that there's the rule of law, that law is universalizable in some particular way. The next essay we're going to go
we'll
into.
talk about that. We talk about that in the next essay, that
Yeah.
the idea that law can be universalizable is, I think, itself considered an aspect of white supremacy.
Yes.
Feature of white supremacy.
Is what they're going to end up saying.
Yeah.
And then equal protection seems to be, because it doesn't give necessarily equal outcomes. Therefore, so again, the question is how much of this is being analyzed versus how much of it is these are actually concepts they're just looking to undermine. It seems like it's more of concepts that they're willing or have undermined.
And not necessarily, I don't think, knowing what would replace it. I mean, law and context theories. Okay, so there are law and context theories out there, but especially when we get into again, applying this to our theology. Again, the whole program here being trying to excise Christianity from features of Eurocentric Enlightenment thought, I guess, is again how we've at least articulated what we think whiteness is being. Whiteness, again, is just more of a rhetorical term, I think. But when we get into some of the other, it's sort of like Eurocentric rationalism born out of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Now, just for historical matter of point here, Nathan's going to place the emergence of pigmentocracies, which is the hierarchy of racial categories, in or around the 15th century in Portugal, especially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is, now he shifts. I made this point, I think, before, but he provides a quote from, I believe, Kimberly Crenshaw, and then says, then he defines white supremacy as, then he quotes someone else. Now, I made this comment before. I did some digging into it. I don't know the relationship between the two different sources, but it didn't seem like it would have been necessarily a fair treatment of Crenshaw herself to quote her and then cite another book and saying, but this is what she is using white supremacy to mean, and not quoting her own work, but quoting someone else's work. I don't know if it's necessarily clear that when she says that, she has in her mind, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands. At least from the sections he's quoting from, I don't know. I think
and again,
a little more needs to be.
This was a series of essays. The assumption would be that everybody makes mistakes, and this would be cleared up at some point.
He then goes,
and of course, the second interest is that, okay, now, and what is the activism piece? Well, what are we going to do about this problem of all of these institutions and systems in the West having been constructed for the sake of white people?
Yeah. So those would be the two interests, that the white supremacy produced these particular kinds of systems. The second one's going to be, the activism portion.
Yeah.
Real quick, he lists a bunch of court cases and then says it betrays the United States as a white nationalist project at its inception and reveal the lengths people went to maintain this racial identity. I think this is a critique I've said before.
Yeah.
What's often missing is the context of a lot of these particular instances. So, for example, the Dred Scott case he uses, obviously, I think a miscarriage of justice on his ruling. You have the buildup of a lot of these laws, a lot of fights between the North and South up until this point. I think it gets even to the point where Lincoln connects Dred Scott as sort of the first instance that led to kind of the inevitable Civil War at this point. When that ruling came down, it was like, well, all the progress we had made on trying to hem in slavery, not expand it, try to keep the Union together, with the Supreme Court nullifying most of that progress in one decision. He's like, well, it seems like war is now at this point inevitable. He misses that, context, which is
Yeah,
important.
I hope he's got some history friends in the history department who are also going through this, because that does seem problematic to me, just to say this betrays the United States. Well, what was the United States in 1857? Right? It was divided. You know,
Yeah,
there
exactly.
was no
On issues of race
exactly.
specifically.
You
Well,
can't
and then the
really
other
say it that way. You can't really
no,
say it betrays the whole United States as a white nationalist project. And when you're listing legal acts that are from the 1823, 1855, 1857, some of which, as you just pointed out, were the straw that broke the camel's back with regards to dividing the United States and
yeah,
sending us into a civil war. Where,
exactly.
yeah,
And what they're missing. So when he talks about the 1719 Naturalization Act, what he's missing is, for most of the from that period of time in history, what you're seeing is very routinely different laws being passed continually about who's allowed in, who's not allowed in. It starts with, I think it's the Plantation Act of 1740, which was this idea that you had to be Protestant, specifically Anglican. So this is under British control, and so you see actually the progression where the naturalization laws for a time is expanding. So he picks up and says he was only white people. Well, before that, it was only Protestants that were allowed. Catholics were specifically not allowed to become U.S. citizens. Well, at this point, British subjects, right? So then there's residency requirements. It's expanding. Then you have the expansion into Native Americans within Mississippi are allowed to join in. Then you have the Civil War. So the context that's being fought right now over citizenship rights, he misses the citizenship debate between subjectship versus contractarian sort of views of citizenship. That's all happening. The 14th Amendment, all these things are happening in between these court cases he cites,
right,
which doesn't say he's wrong in the superficial view that there are court cases that came down that said only whites can be citizens or only whites and blacks can become citizens. He doesn't use that naturalization act that was passed during that time
right.
that was happening. He kind of ignores the underlying debate that shows how complex and how divided and heated the issue was, which ended up, between, I think, what Plessy Ferguson and the Chinese or Dred Scott, between Dred Scott and I guess you could say Plessy versus Ferguson. You have the Civil War, right?
Right. Well,
Chinese Exclusion Act is happening, right after this. It seems like so. It's like
I
you're
just think
missing a huge
with,
point. You're
with
missing a huge.
so like a little bit of an emotional point, but think of like one of my favorite movies of all time, Glory, with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick as Robert Gould Shaw, who we had to learn about in the military. In our military, our basic training handbook, you had to learn about certain military heroes, and Robert Gould Shaw was one of those. And you think of like, again, the statement, it betrays the United States as a white nationalist project at its inception and reveals the lengths people went to maintain this racial identity. That's just not entirely the truth. I mean, you're not going to, you can't say that about somebody like a Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th Massachusetts, which was the first black regiment put together by the Union Army. And, at some point, you got people fighting and dying next to each other. you just can't say that somebody like a Robert Gould Shaw was trying to maintain that racial identity that is white supremacy. It's like, come on, at some point, give up your story, because, at the end of the day, you're doing a disservice to a lot of people, real people, who put their lives on the line for each other, So
Yeah.
it bothers me. Anyways, okay. The five common conclusions then that we'll wrap up with. So there were the two interests of trying to understand how white supremacy got embedded into the system, going back to Portugal and the slave trade, which we
Yeah.
mentioned, but we do in the
Well,
next
and
one.
he ends that paragraph just as we move on. He says, "This activist commitment makes CRT an anti-racist project."
Yeah.
What I think needs to, revisiting that original definition he provides, that CRT is a movement aimed at providing an anti-racist understanding of the relationship between race and law. I think, for example, the activist. So it's not necessarily an objective scholarship. We can see this in his conclusions, but there's a fundamental commitment to activism, which I don't think comes through very clearly in the definition.
Yeah.
But anyways, first, the 5 common conclusions.
Right. The 5 points. First one is here's the biggest problem. I mean, here's the fundamental.
This is where I think a lot of people will jump off.
And this is where I think most Christians should jump off, right here.
Yep.
So first of the 5 common conclusions that shape the project of critical race theory is this, quote, rejecting the prevailing orthodoxy that scholarship should be or could be neutral and objective, end quote. Yep. So even if you think scholarship could be objective, it shouldn't be a normative claim there.
Yeah, so there's and that's what I think people might miss, is there's that normative claim, which is what CRT isn't saying we've been too biased, and so we need to become less biased in our scholarship. That's not a possibility.
No, it's not. And I will reference the forthcoming article I have here in the Journal for Christian Legal Studies on the problem of having our own logics based upon the social group or the racial identity that we choose, because this is it. This is, whether it's, want to call it perspectivalism or standpoint epistemology, and I made I quoted Judge Sonia Sotomayor's, Justice Sotomayor's, it was a 2001 speech she gave at Berkeley before she was Supreme Court Justice, talking about there being no universal definition of wisdom, and she was playing off of Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court Justice, who made the famous claim, or is attributed to her, that if you put an older white man and a wise older white man and a wise older white woman in the same room together, they would eventually come to the same conclusion given the same set of data and evidence and facts and stuff. The character, the difference being male and female. Mayor kind of says she doesn't believe that. You can read it for yourself, the speech, but that she's not, at least not sure that there's anything like a universal wisdom there. Well, at this point, I feel like I just need to chuck my Bible out the window. I mean, what is Proverbs telling us about wisdom? What are the Psalms telling us about wisdom? If this is also going to be our approach to theology, then again, you're not just getting contextual theology. You're getting what my colleague and my friend Ed Echeverria and I were talking about with correlation theology, which is a very different method of doing, or dialogical theology. Right? That just as history changes, so does everything else. Everything.
Yeah, and I think that what's important is you'd have to ask the question, does this particular conclusion apply to Nathan's paper as well?
Right. But
it's not clear.
Is he going, right now he's only explaining to us.
Yes.
The question though is that if he's trafficking again in social theory, which as history goes, so society goes, as society goes, so does reality.
Yeah.
Well, then we at least have our right now we're a little bit on the defensive. We're bracing that.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to that question of what is saying as a race scholar, how is that functioning, and what's the attribution to that? Is that to say as a CRT scholar? Is that do these apply to what you're doing?
So although the races are socially constructed, once they're constructed, they have this social reality. And then is it really going to be the case that different subsections of a society are producing incompatible areas of knowledge? And then where that's going to lead is to, again, we've mentioned it so many times, some kind of Nietzschean sort of view where then, well, the only thing that can adjudicate between which generated set of knowledge is the accepted one is whoever's got the political power, which
is the second one, which is, I think,
which is the second point, the second conclusion.
Yeah, which is what I think, at least to Kimberly Crenshaw, this is who he's quoting, at least to her credit, I do think she's pointing to the natural conclusions that if you accept the first, this is the second thing that does, I think, come about. She writes, or he writes, a second, because perspectives are inherently political, right? So if there's no objective reality, I think that's fair to say that they become social or contingent upon the prevailing views of society. CRT scholars contend that scholarship, quote, the formal production, identification, organization of that, or rather what will be called knowledge, is inevitably political, end quote. Legal histories, this is now Nathan, for example, establish political visions of a country through which they highlight or ignore. So law, if you don't have objective reality, if they're not trying to find out what is just and what is true and or what is moral, then laws function as establishing political visions.
Right. Law is a useful fiction.
Yeah.
For other goals. I mean, and here in the Crenshaw quote, just so I'll make a reference. She says, the formal production ellipses of what will be called knowledge. And it's hard. I don't think we can stress this enough. And Charles Taylor, in his book, A Secular Age, outlines the history of moving from a mimetic culture to a poesious culture. The mimetic culture, again, being the culture that believes that it is mimicking an order that is embedded in the cosmos. Right? We are on a journey of discovery. The poesious culture, the shift towards poesious, is not that we are trying to create or ground our social structures in a higher reality that we can discover, but that we create things and then call them higher realities. There really is, it's generating knowledge. It's not discovering truth. I don't think there's anything more incompatible than that to a Christian worldview, to a biblical worldview.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could apply this just to different commandments or laws by which God issued. I mean, is this where we get
just relevant to Moses in his day? I mean,
or I mean, not even just relevant to the moment day, but that they were just established, not necessary for the moral conduct or for the development of a particular society, but for the sole purpose of just promoting some political vision.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, so here we go. And again, we don't know if Nathan is going to embrace this in his own work, but again, we're suspicious. So, and this is where too, also, when you get into the mimesis versus the poesious culture, this is why now you're seeing people in the hard sciences getting real nervous as well, because the hard sciences are downstream from this, or they're under.
Well, they are being under
from
scrutiny.
Yeah.
Which would, I mean, this could be an interesting conversation when you have, mathematicians and physicists and biologists being attacked, even though they don't have scholarship backgrounds in CRT. Does their scholarship in their hard science lend credit to the defense of that hard science? That would be an interesting question to have.
Right. That's why we need, you see manifestations like this when you get feminist glaciology, which was an actual paper in, I think, Science. the journal Science. Okay, third conclusion is that CRT advocates conclude that the civil rights movement was insufficient, basically.
Yeah.
Now, David, yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is interesting. So he says that third, CRT scholarship argues that analysis of U.S. histories of law should promote a, quote, deep dissatisfaction with traditional civil rights discourse, end quote. Here's what I don't understand. If that is a conclusion of CRT, then what is the objection to John MacArthur, and he quotes him that, saying that CRT is a source of anger, resentment, and vengeful separation? It seems like does a deep dissatisfaction
Close
promote?
enough, right?
Is that close enough?
Close
Now are we
enough.
just kind of
Yeah.
are we just mincing words at this point, going, well, that's
Well-
not the exact technical word. He's not angry. He's just deeply dissatisfied. I don't know if that's a distinction with much of a difference.
Well, and I want to point something out, and we won't have time to really go into this, but we'll have to do another episode where we try and get a little bit more into this, the spirituality here. I mean, there is a sense of where Marx and other sort of revolutionaries, and you see some of this in Thomas Sowell's book when he talks about the people who hold to the unconstrained vision of man, where man is unconstrained by anything like a human nature or original sin, and we're perfectible in our own power. I mean, spiritually speaking, what are we talking about here? Are we our own gods? Really? I mean, how much perfection are we looking for here? And do we really think that we can attain it if we just, again, continue to tweak the system? Look, C.S. Lewis.
Well, it's not tweaking the system. If we overthrow the system, could we then obtain it?
I'm sorry, constantly overthrow it.
Yeah.
I think it's a perpetual revolution. This is what C.S. Lewis describes hell as in Screwtape Letters, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it's weird is that any overthrow of the system is just going to be what? A set of laws that promote a vision of society that is not objectively better or worse than the previous, or it's just constant revolution.
There's a great song by The Who that sums it all up. It's called Won't Get Fooled Again. Everybody should just listen to that song, and then you'll know what we're talking about, and read the lyrics.
There you go. Well, and then here's the question then. Like, if that's what it promotes, when you say deeply dissatisfied, what does that even mean anymore? Where it's the perpetual evolution of a particular system that has no sort of anchor to anything objective. Do you get, I mean, in other words, is what John MacArthur highlighting just downstream, right, of what happens? You get anger, resentment, and vicious, separation of people.
Well, and he says, citizens in the U.S. ignored their racist past. That's certainly true to some extent.
Yeah.
Misrepresented the legal systems undergirding that past. But here's the kicker, I think, and settled for relatively minor remedies rather than radical reconstruction. Now, I would contest that the civil rights movement has had a major hand in things like interracial marriages happening. Are interracial marriages minor remedies to the problem of racism?
I mean, that's where they have to go. I mean, at least that's what they're claiming. If these aren't, I mean, this is where you see the whole
in life, except two people living together for the entirety of their lives and producing, children who are racially different, even if it is a social construct. That would be, to me, the ultimate goal. And if you got that, you're doing good. When I was on a panel discussion up in Oregon on this, Dr. David Manick, who's he's half Japanese, half Finnish, I believe. And he was raised by Scotch-Irish parents because his biological parents died young. I think he's got a PhD in psychiatry or neuroscience. And I think he's got a master's from Fuller in theology. And he said, here's my answer to racial injustice: interracial marriage. We should all just find spouses who look different than us and have kids. But he was serious. I mean, look, it's like Come on, it's a human solution to
Yeah.
the
Well, and
problem.
I mean,
I'm
and again,
digressing a little bit,
well,
but
and
yeah,
I think, as we move on, I mean, that's
yeah,
another question to have. Like, is the Civil War not considered a radical reconstruction? I mean, what, again, this goes to the question, okay, what more do you want? I mean,
what do you want?
hundreds of thousands of people died for this,
Yeah,
and that's not radical enough. I mean, and maybe this is where you get to see maybe some of the, speculating, where you see these power dynamic philosophies that come out where hundreds of thousands just aren't enough for the social vision. Look at societies that have adopted these kind of utopian social
yeah,
visions.
yeah.
Hundreds of thousands
Yeah.
usually, unfortunately, aren't enough.
Well, and you might, and the other, and the thing that I wanted when I went go back to is CRT, especially with some of these conclusions about radical. I mean, needing a radical renovation or reconstruction. What else do you want to throw out that was sort of born out of Eurocentric Enlightenment culture? How about the history of medicine? I mean, why not get rid of all of our medical technologies? Because those seem to have done pretty well under the rule of Eurocentric post Enlightenment culture,
Yeah.
better than in most non European cultures, right? So maybe we should take a second look at the last 300 or 400 years of development in medical technologies.
Hmm. Yeah. And this is it. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning. I'm not going to go too far to the very front of the article, but I think this is important when you ask, well, what do you want?
Yeah.
He does say it's just in passing, and if you don't look at the citation, you'd miss it. He just says that he quoting Nathan, all these horrendous injustices force Christians to reconsider how to love their neighbor in a racialized society. Now, what is he referring to? He's referring to a study from a book. And I'm just going to read the I mean, I read through some of the reviews of the synopses and some of the step-by-step arguments that are taken with it, but just to quote something that for the audience that they can at least get a picture of what they're going with. I think this is just the back coverage where the quote comes from. But the book writes, the authors write, through a nationwide telephone survey of 2,000 people and an additional 200 face-to-face interviews, Michael O. Emerson and Christian Smith probed the grassroots of white evangelical America. They found that despite recent efforts by the movement's leaders to address the problem of racial discrimination, evangelicals themselves seem to be preserving America's racial chasm. In fact, most white evangelicals see no systemic discrimination against blacks. Again, just be careful. They're not saying they don't see no discrimination, they don't see no systemic discrimination, which is different. But the authors contend that it is not active racism that prevents evangelicals from recognizing ongoing problems in American society. So there you go. They deny that part, the discrimination part. Instead, it is the evangelical movement's emphasis on individualism, free will, and personal relationships that makes invisible the pervasive injustice that perpetuates racial inequality. So you have at least three things that they're going to attribute. It's the emphasis on individualism, free will, and personal relationships, which seem to be, is this what you'd have to give up? That seems a pretty tough to swallow, to give those things up.
Yeah, yeah. We talked about individualism and merit in one of the previous the podcast that we did on the panel discussion, and that'll kind of come up again when we did in our video on part 2 of this essay, especially the meritocracy. I think the idea that we shouldn't maintain our focus on individual personal relationships, and people will make the say, like, if it's saying, like, to emphasize individual and personal relationships is to deny that there are institutional issues. Well, no, it's not. But to say that the answer to institutional issues is better personal relationships, I think, is the argument.
Yeah.
Is breaking down the barriers between persons so that you form better communities and cultures. That's the argument. So that seems very straw mannish to me. And what are you going to do then? Are you actually going to tell people not to have personal relationships and friendships and marriages? Which to me is just, then you're basically you're working from something. I don't know. That's like Sartre or something. That's some kind of demonically inspired existentialist dark philosophy. I don't know.
Yeah.
Fourth conclusion: the narrowing of remedial actions. Scholars contend that the narrowing of remedial actions requires acknowledging that although, quote, civil rights advocates met with some success in the nation's courts and legislators, end quote from whoever, these successes ought not obscure the central role the American legal order played in the de-radicalization of racial liberation movements. Again, there's that liberation word, which goes back to the existentialists, Marx and the existentialist philosophers. At what point are we liberated?
Yeah.
So, in other words, the
How far does it
radical
go?
racial movement was defanged. It was defanged. So the civil rights movement, in short, just wasn't radical enough, right?
Yeah, that's going to be their argument.
Now, this is where also you start to worry about what exactly do they want? Are we moving into some kind of, and we've seen this, thought control, getting into people's heads, changing language. I mean, this is all the stuff of Big Brother. I'm not, again, he's just explaining for us at this
point. Yeah. Again, I mean, he has a little bit of his book coming out. He has some more articles that we will be going through. But I mean, Michelle Alexander gives an example where they said, oh, maybe we could, she talks about felony employment. There's some contradictions within her book that I think, but we'll just ignore the contradictions for the second, where she says, okay, what we did was we got rid of the box, is what she argued. And then she goes on to explain, well, there then became another system which seemed to also discriminate. And so what we need to do is change the mindset. Now, again, I think this is where you're going to see conservatives and maybe not necessarily just liberals, but this sort of utopian visionary people, is where conservatives are going to be more asking the question, okay, how do you try to remediate racial tensions or racial discrimination through policies or personal action that can get at the person and sort of make the best sort of society in a society that will never be perfect, versus those who are saying, but you know what, if we do these few things, we can make a perfect society. And I think that's this sort of ideological tension, is how much is enough? Is perfection the only standard by which I mean, this is the conversation you have with like epistemology. Is certainty the criteria by which we evaluate all theories? Or is there some sort of imperfect knowledge at which we have to say is good enough, and try to work from that view?
Fallibilism, as a friend of ours would call it.
Yeah.
So the dual framing of race as race consciousness and race consciousness as irrational left inhabitants in the U.S. linguistically destitute. And again, here, and he talked about this in the panel discussion about, it became, the idea was that if you were even conscious of race, that was irrational. He says the Black Panthers were trying to reach across the border and bring whites into their community. Ku Klux Klan, obviously not. But, the idea here being that most people wanted to just not thought that if you even looked at race or thought about it, that itself was irrational.
Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a misnomer.
Yeah,
because I don't see a lot of people denying that race is important. I do see the conversation that race is no longer fundamental.
Yeah,
I mean, important can be used in varying ways. It could be important in bad ways. It can be important in good ways. But I think the real kind of heavy work that's being done, or the real heavy contest that's been waged, is whether or not race is fundamentally important, or is it not? And I think the argument that it's not fundamentally important is more in line with the Christian doctrine of being created in the image of God, and so on and so forth.
And I think too, McWhorter argues as well. I think, I don't quote me on that, although it's on the video, but I think he also talks about race not being fundamental. And I think Coleman Hughes has a new book coming out where he's arguing for the colorblind theory of race and meritocracy as being preferable to seeing race as fundamental, or maybe even central. I don't know. I think there is a Christian response here, which is something like a celebration of ethnic diversity in the body of Christ.
It seems like ethnic or even incapacity. As well.
Right, and we'll have to do another episode on a more positive approach here. And then fifth, of course, is I love this term. I'm sorry. I don't love it. I think it's ridiculous. But he says, fifth, CRT scholars agree that social forms of organized forgetting enabled a massive rewriting. Now, I'm sure he's using that metaphorically, right? I mean, nobody actually got everybody together and said, all right, everybody, all right, let's get the whole society of historians together and let's forget.
Yeah, the whole like pink elephant deal.
Right. But
not going to think about it anymore.
I guess this would be like a selective, what he's saying is there was a selective rewriting of history, which is interesting, of history that left out, with that bolstered colorblind meritocracy, which is a white aspect of whiteness. This is what I think Hughes is going to argue for, that we should have a colorblind meritocracy. So that this was a rewriting of history in promoting the idea of a colorblind meritocracy as a solution. And then, of course, people would quote Martin Luther King Jr. out of context. Not really sure if they did, but he claims that, quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I mean, he's probably referring to, and I don't want to impute too much, is just that popular quote that flies around about the content of your character, but not the color of your skin. I think is probably
right.
Which I'm not sure is a meritocracy argument. It's more of a virtue-based argument.
Right, and we'll deal with more with the meritocracy question in the second, and we do in the second, and I'll probably also in the third part of this essay, because I don't think when people, especially like some of these other critical race theory theorists who are theologians, and they talk about meritocracy as being an aspect of whiteness or a feature of whiteness, that has to be sort of, again, expunged from our religious thinking or our theological thinking. Because
it would be interesting to see. I don't see meritocracy coming out of the colonial age. Most of these were kingdoms, so they had a landed nobility, they had a monarchy. So you don't really see meritocracy coming into the picture until you see something like an advanced form of capitalism. But again, that's not coming until maybe.
I mean, social roles were certainly more fixed prior to the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution in virtue of people's birth, right?
Yeah. So you have to make, even saying it's just Western European thought that produced this, you also have to realize there is a history of Western thought which didn't start with meritocracy as really being a fundamental view of anything, really.
I mean, here's one suggestion for especially maybe some of the theologians that were on that panel that we will link to. If you don't want individual meritocracy, we could go back to something like Middle Ages, where in virtue of your birth, that is your status. And that's where you stay the entirety of your life. And there's sort of the royalty, there's the, various classes, and you just are in that class. And that would probably also apply to who you can marry, who you can be friends with. Hey, we could go back to a system like that.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of traditional Roman Catholics might. I don't know. I'll have to ask my friends.
Yeah. But it's just, American meritocracy, equal opportunity. These are ideas that do have a history in which they were developed.
The Russian communist system where you gauge what society needs. And then you just say, we need
reorder
so many million bricklayers. We need so and so million. And it doesn't matter if you're good at that or bad at that. That's what you're going to do, because that's what we need
What
in order.
society needs or something. Yeah.
So
So there's other, I guess, other options. It's just, you know, you're going to have to, again, this comes, I guess, maybe to a context argument where it's like, well, maybe what they think when they say meritocracy is just what, everyone just gets what they deserve. And that's not necessarily meritocracy.
Yeah.
In fact, meritocracy was trying to loosen up the rigid social rules, and was, in a very ironic way, a liberating, quote unquote, endeavor.
I mean, well, I don't want to get off. There are maybe some arguments for something like having just fixed social roles. Gives us, in some sense, more stability. But again, does anybody really want to go back there?
Yeah.
Okay, so those were the 5 points. So the last one again being that there was an organized forgetting of history, a promotion of colorblind meritocracy as the solution to our social ills, and
well, he ends with this quote, at least in this section.
Right.
We can look at the last section briefly, but he, I don't know who he's quoting.
Yeah,
it's not clear, but he just says, rather than engaging in a broad-scale inquiry into why jobs, wealth, education, and power are distributed as they are, mainstream civil rights discourse suggests that the irrational bias of race consciousness are eradicated, everyone will be treated fairly as equal competitors in a regime of equal opportunity. There's a few things that make this very troublesome. The first part is a broad-scale inquiry into why jobs, wealth, education, power are distributed as they are. This is, if there's no other job for an economist, it's this. Why are jobs distributed throughout an economy in a particular kind of way? So I think there has been widespread, and you're going to have to read the economic literature to kind of see that unfold. They do a lot of digging into what human beings are and how are they supposed to flourish, and what sort of economic theories are more conducive to human flourishing. So there's a history of intellectual investigation that could be brought there. The second one is this idea that everyone will be treated fairly. I don't know. It depends on what you mean by fairly.
Yeah.
Because given equal opportunity well, it depends on how you talk about equal opportunity. Right there's so much crunched in. You're going to really have to, I don't think we have time in this episode to go over it, but what does it mean to be treated fairly? Does it mean something like a meritocracy? Does it mean something like you're getting what you deserve? Because it doesn't seem like people were committed that if you eliminated racism, you would eliminate
race consciousness. Yeah.
Well, not even race consciousness, but like certain things just aren't going to be valued in society. Right. So like the value of your production wasn't going to be set or fixed in what would be, well, this is a Marxian view. Like the labor costs are automatically put into the value of the product, which isn't entirely true, because if it's not a valued product, it's not going to sell. Doesn't matter if it took you 10 years to make it, unfortunately. So there's just you're gonna have to break that down a little bit.
All right, and then the final paragraph here is towards a Christian response. So again, maybe I got a little wound up earlier, because again, we are assuming that there's a Christianizing, there's going to be a bringing the biblical worldview to bear on critical race theory that is somehow going to amend or alter it in such a way that it will not only be compatible with Christian metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, but will help us to enhance our how we can think about justice in the world. Okay, he says, how should Christians respond to these common interests and conclusions? They should begin by recalling that Christ and the apostles called the church to foster justice and mercy, giving special attention to the marginalized and the oppressed. And he cites a few Bible chapters here, Matthew 25 and James 1. Now, this did raise question. Now, I would reference here my dialogue with Dr. Cal Beisner, the social justice versus biblical justice interview. Because obviously we are going to give special attention to the marginalized and oppressed. But Dr. Beisner did a good job of what the Bible actually says about the marginalized, oppressed, who they are, and what we're actually supposed to do towards them.
No, exactly.
Okay. Now, one question that does come up, though, on my mind, if we don't Christianize in some way or bring the biblical data to bear on CRT, I mean, what happens when one group that was marginalized, well, Jacob made this point, can a group that is currently marginalized or considered marginalized or oppressed, can they become non-marginalized or non-oppressed? Or, in virtue of the social fact of race, are they always oppressed, regardless of their power?
Yeah. Well, and the additional question you have not, I don't know if there's a question of do they become non-oppressed, but once someone becomes not oppressed, do they automatically become oppressor? Yeah.
Well, that's that. That was my other question is there a third state? Or are there only the two states? Is there a neutral ground where you are neither the oppressor nor the oppressed? Is that just heaven?
Right. I mean,
of God, I don't know.
Well, it would seem, at least if there was a neutral position, it would have to be connected in some fundamental way to the prevailing law. So maybe that's what they would argue. Well, it depends on what the legal system is, if it permits a neutral, I guess. I don't know. Seems like the theory itself doesn't lend to a clear explanation, though.
Right. I haven't seen one. I haven't seen any answer to that question yet. Is there a third state where a social group or a racial group is neither oppressor nor oppressed? Maybe that's a research question. So, it says that this he says there's been a lot of shoddy work done. Maybe this is
we're contributing to the shoddy work.
We're contributing to the shoddy work. So, Dr. Cartagena, we apologize for that. We must labor to understand and evaluate CRT in light of history, political philosophy, sociology, theology, et cetera, et cetera. This is what neighbor love demands. I'm going to punt to just getting out there and having good friendships and personal relationships. But go ahead. Yeah. I mean, do both if you can. But, okay, so that sets us up for the next two essays, which we have part 2 done already. We'll reference just at the end here as we wrap up. Did you have any more comments just on that final paragraph?
Just one. He writes, and either require, he said, and either require treating the varied positions tied to these conclusions. You never know these requirements by reading Christians' pithy rejections or shallow endorsements of CRT. Yeah. I think it's fair. That's a fair assessment. I would just be careful that there's been a lot of Christian scholarship that has levied, I think, legit criticism against CRT. And I didn't see a lot of that being brought into this discussion.
Right. And I would say that even if I just listened to a podcast with Scott Ray, Dr. Scott Ray at Talbot School of Theology, interviewing David French, where David, and I was a little worried about David French because I thought, is he trying to talk about everything? But he does have a lot of experience with critical race theory. I had forgotten, of course, that he did his law degree at Harvard in the 90s, I think 90s, maybe early 2000s. And he said, quote, I wasn't just introduced to critical race theory. He says, I was marinated in critical race theory, because that's what was being taught in the legal department at Harvard. He had to, learn these theories. So he does have a long history with this. And I think it's safe to say, based on what I've read from his pen and heard him say in his interviews, that while he might say critical race theory can give us some descriptive tools, some way to describe localized phenomena, like why maybe some Black communities don't have certain things that white communities do. I think, he's made it clear that critical race theory as a macro level way of looking at like American history, any kind of macro level thing, like the history
Yeah.
of America,
Yeah.
or as in any way being able to prescribe a way forward. I think he's pretty clear that this is not something that Christians can embrace. It can't be used as a universal hermeneutical lens through which we see all of society and culture and theology. And it can't really prescribe much as far as solutions, maybe even to these more localized, concrete issues.
Yeah, and so it seems like some of the academic work would be, I think, in part breaking CRT away from some of the initial visions of how CRT would be used.
Right. And so anyways, we'll end there. Hopefully that'll give Dr. Cartagena some things to think about, but I doubt he'll even see this video. So, but anyways, thank you for everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time.